the reason I was hesitant to say this is because I know that there are churches that literally have that language on their website. I'm not picking on you specifically, but if you pull up, you'll find some version. The words might change, but essentially what they're saying is like, show up Sunday, join a small group midweek thing, and then somehow serve either the church or the community. Mm-hmm. And if you do those three things, that's what it means to be a disciple. And the thing about that is that you can max out that definition of discipleship inside of a week. Welcome to the Uncut Podcast. I'm Pastor Luke.
I am Pastor Cameron.
And this is the Uncut Podcast, where we have uncut, honest conversations about faith, life, and ministry. So, Cameron, we're sitting down on a gloomy Thursday afternoon because we live in Western New York.
We did see a strange yellow orb in the sky yesterday for a couple hours.
It made me so happy.
It really made me happy too. It really did. I went out to do some feed our animals in our barn early in the morning, and the sun was coming up, and I just kind of stood in the field next to my barn and just like looked at the sun and let the warmth and the light, just the sunlight, hit my face, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is what I need.
I'm sure somebody out there who knows, like weather and understands the science of it. But I was thinking about it the other day. I was like, why is it just that? I mean, it's fine that it's cold, but why does the sun actually have to disappear? Why is it cloudier in these winter months than it is in the warmer months? And I'm sure it's got something to do with air pressure and humidity and all that jazz. So, but I don't know. I find it so abysmal that it's just one giant gray slab outside.
Yeah.
So
I have never been the type of person that has recognized that had been like, oh, we haven't seen the sun in X amount of days.
Yeah.
To me, it's just like always been like, well, this is just kind of
because you've lived here your whole life.
My whole life, yeah. This is just how it is, But for whatever reason, this year I'm feeling like, oh wow, a little bit of sunshine would be like game changing today.
Yeah. Well, this is totally not what we had planned to talk about, but I watched this video online because I spend too much time online, and there was this guy with this like light meter, and he was measuring just the different like amount of light exposure and type of light exposure you get when you're inside versus being outside. And he's like, yeah, like on a sunny day, obviously you're going to get more sun exposure. It's going to do better things for your circadian rhythm and stuff like that. But even the amount of light that we're getting on a day like today, where we cannot see the sun, it's overcast, it's gray out there, it is still so much more light than what you get inside. Mm-hmm. I can't remember because I don't remember if he was measuring lumens or what he was measuring on that little thing, but it was like, like maybe you're like 100 inside, and like on a cloudy day, it was like a couple hundred. It was like 500, 600. On a bright day, it's a ton.
Yeah. But
he was just like, but the magnitude of sun exposure you get outside, even on a cloudy day, so much better than even sitting next to a window inside.
Right.
I was like, it just sucks that it's also cold outside. It's the other deterrent that keeps us from going outside. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of hold on, wait for spring.
Yeah, which is it is one of the beautiful things about like the church calendar and the way it's kind of structured is that I was thinking about this last night, that, Advent is kind of this move towards hope, even as the days get shorter and it gets darker and darker. Mm-hmm. And then Lent, which is fast approaching, comes in early spring at the very, maybe late winter, early spring mark. And it's kind of a, even though the days are getting longer, it's a more inward and more reflective and maybe a darker journey. Lent is, because you're reflecting on your sin and all of that. But it's leading up to this very hopeful, regenerative new celebration with the coming of spring. So, yeah. just thinking about the way the seasons line up with the church calendar.
Yes, I think redemption is woven into the created world.
Yeah,
For sure.
it is. So. But anyways, we were thinking, before we turned on the microphones and everything, we were kind of talking about we were talking about kind of discipleship and maybe some ideas that we were having listened to a podcast that we both found and we really enjoyed and appreciated and listened to. And we were kind of thinking about what that means for like discipleship and kind of a corrective for it. So Cameron, do you want to kind of take us from there?
Yeah. So the podcast was Carey Nieuwhof's podcast, and we'll link it here in the notes.
Yep.
But Carey was a pastor, a pretty large church, left pastoral ministry and started writing and doing leadership work and stuff like that. I think he's got a pretty, he got a story of burnout and a story of, I wouldn't say disenchantment, but just like ministry was going a different way. And he interviews John Mark Comer, who I guess surprisingly is kind of like the same story.
Yeah.
Yeah, leading a pretty big church, mega church out in the Pacific Northwest. He had said something like 93 staff or something like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, is a what I would say is kind of like the modern day church guru on what we would call now discipleship.
Yeah.
And the simplification of life, and probably his most famous book is entitled The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry.
Yep.
Very good book. And they were sitting down just to talk, I think, really kind of about the state of discipleship in the evangelical church today.
Yeah. It was kind of a launching pad off of his most recent book, which I think I've mentioned on the podcast. I started listening to this last week, something like that. I'm listening to it on audiobook, which does count as reading, Cameron.
It does not.
But his new book, whether you listen or read to it, is Practicing the Way.
I bought the book, and I will read it like a grown adult. And it's going to be here today, actually. But anyway, they have a lot of conversation about the state of discipleship in the church today. And I think one of the main questions that they ask that they describe as being the shadow portion of the evangelical church today, which is like, you want to describe, you're a little bit more in tune with the language of the shadow. Yeah. Do you want to describe kind of like what you felt like he meant about that comment? Yeah.
So shadow, like if anyone who's listening is like really tuned into like psychoanalytic or like psychology language, and it's kind of it's not part of like the new part of psychology. This is kind of older stuff that I think is still very valuable. But the idea of us having a shadow, of everyone having a shadow. When I talk about it, because I bring this up in stuff when I talk about like addiction and stuff I've done with Rooted, of having a false self and a shadow. And the false self is like, and maybe this isn't the right way to talk about it when we apply it to the conversation they're talking about, but it's this idea of what we present to the world, this false self. And when we have a false self, that creates a shadow. And maybe we always will have a shadow. And the shadow is the parts of yourself that you maybe don't want to accept. They can be good things and bad things. Like in Christian language, we might talk of them as like the old self, the old Adam, right? The body of sin that we're trying to put to death would be included in the shadow. But I would say that there's also things that end up in the shadow that are maybe good things, or maybe gifts and things like that we maybe just don't want to accept. So like all that to say that like if you're dealing with, here's a classic example. If you see someone who is, someone who's like really kind of always making themselves the center of the stage, what you would see them, you're like, oh, well, they're so confident, they're so forward, they're all of this. Chances are is that the more they kind of tend to put themselves out there, want the center of attention and all of that, the more likely, in just general human terms, that they have a shadow that includes significant insecurities and fear about rejection. So all that to say that there is kind of this public representation, and then there's always a shadow to it. And they kind of bring that and talk about that to into church world.
Yeah.
Right? Applying it not just to individuals, but applying it to organizations and stuff like that.
Right.
Now, I think probably the false self part of it is maybe not as helpful. Yeah. Another way we could talk about it is like a lot of times like our gifts, like the thing we're really good at. Like someone who's maybe like an Enneagram 2 who loves to help people, loves to just always show up for people. That's a gift. But what's the shadow of that gift?
They have no boundaries. They'll make themselves physically, mentally, emotionally unhealthy.
Yep.
In the pursuit of being the person that shows up for the other one.
Right.
Yeah.
So a gift and a shadow. So maybe that's an even more simpler way to kind of talk about it than the way I was talking about it. But so all that to say, they're just like, all right, the church
has a shadow.
There's things that the church has that are gifts.
Yep.
Right? Which they don't talk too much about, but there are gifts to the way that our churches operate and things like that. But with those gifts, perhaps exist shadows. So
yes. Yeah, that's essentially what they said is like, is the church aware of its shadows? Generally, you have to be pretty self-aware to be aware of your shadow, whether you're a church or a person. But they talk about it specifically as it pertains to discipleship. So the self, right, the church, does a lot of things to help people grow in their relationship with Jesus, right? Yep. They offer communal worship services and small groups and Sunday school classes and Bible studies and opportunities to serve and to fellowship with one another and all of these things. And so they're doing all of these things with the intention of, we want you to become more and more like Jesus.
Yep.
And we want to become closer to Jesus. Great. That's what we want too. But then the question that is asked, which kind of is the shadow question, is how many churches or church leaders, pastors, whatever, are actually willing to ask the question of whether or not the current methods are effective.
Yeah.
Are they working?
Or effective to what limit?
Right. To what stage of discipleship? To what stage of spiritual growth? And they mention a few books. The Critical Journey is one they talk quite a bit about. You and I have that book here. I've never read it, but I picked it up. So
I've read it like twice, I think now.
Yeah. But they, John Mark Comer essentially is like, I am not sure that the church is honest enough with itself to deal with the shadow of our ineffectiveness at moving people through or bringing people, apprenticing people to Jesus.
Yeah.
And so,
what do you think about that?
I think he's right.
Yeah.
I do. I think he's right. And it may be like, it may be a little bit anecdotal, but I feel like if I look across the span, I would love to know, okay, Jesus, when I get to heaven someday, please tell me the amount of people. Please answer this question for me. I would love to know the number of individual people that have been like, have come through one of the 3 churches that I've served in my time in ministry, who have considered me their pastor, who have sat under my teaching and leadership, whatever. The number of people first. And then the second thing is, I would like to know the number of people that I would confidently say the systems, structures, the programs, the churches that I've led have provided them the best framework to move from the life of sin to the life of righteousness, or the life of like, knowing nothing about Jesus, not walking with Jesus, not living like Jesus, not in communion with the Spirit, not any of those things, to like fully thriving disciple, apprentice, follower of Jesus. And if I'm honest with myself, I would have to say that that number is perilously low. Because I think in a lot of ways, there are, of course, people upon people upon people upon people upon people whose lives are changed. And they, like I'm not saying that all of my ministry is
no,
or that the people that are in my church now at Conduit, like that they're all, untransformed. I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is that I think that the proportion of people who enter into the discipleship ministries of just about any evangelical church now walk through the majority of their life relatively untransformed. And so it makes me question the method, because I don't know, I can't really question anything else. I can't really question their, like, the individual person's like effort, or like the authenticity of their conversion or anything like that. All I can do is say, well, it doesn't feel like we're getting the results that we should get if we all agree that, these are the things that build disciples, small groups and teaching and fellowship. And
well, because like we live in a like program a little bit, or like a programmatic world,
programmatic based ministry.
And so, and like I've kind of said this, I know I've said this to you, and I've probably said this on the podcast, but like if our definition of discipleship is, I'll name it. So like churches have some version of like this is their discipleship plan: gather, grow, and go. Gather on Sunday morning to worship the Lord, praise and fellowship, and hear the teaching. We grow together in community. We get together midweek where we have a Bible study together, and we grow through reading the Word together and praying with one another. And then you've got to go by serving on Sunday morning. Or at best, serving in some sort of outreach. Maybe I'd say a lot of churches, substitute going out into the world for coming and serving at Sunday morning services.
That's disgustingly true.
Yeah, and the thing is the reason I was hesitant to say this is because I know that there are churches that literally have that language on their website: gather, grow, and go.
We're not picking on you. We don't.
I'm not picking on you specifically. It just is really nice alliteration, and it But if you pull up any church, not any church, but a lot of churches, you'll find some version. The words might change, but essentially what they're saying is like show up Sunday, join a small group midweek thing, and then somehow serve either the church or the community. And if you do those three things, that's what it means to be a disciple. And the thing about that is that you can max out that definition of discipleship inside of a week. I can show up to a church if I don't just show up and I kind of like shop around for a little bit, but if I show up, I fill out whatever stupid card that we have and then turn it in, and then I like do the thing and I show up to the group and I serve on a Sunday morning, I've reached the maximum definition of what practically it means to be a disciple. Does that make maturity?
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
there, I said it.
Yeah. Well, good. Good for you. You let your voice be known. Yeah. So I think that that's kind of the crux of what they talk about is this an effective method? Is it really doing what we want it to do? Or is it doing what Jesus wants it to do? Maybe that's the better question.
And I don't, it does do stuff. It does. And it, I don't want to like completely undermine it because it does like going to Sunday service is important. We do think going to a small group is important. We do think serving is important.
Yep.
And they do form us. I think the problem twofold is that sometimes they lack some of the completeness. They like, particularly if they're not, depending on how they're done too, like a different type of small group. There's different types of small groups. And there's some small groups that might be really helpful when you're really early in your faith. But is that the same type of small group that's going to be helpful in 5-10 years down the walk with the Lord? Do you need something different? And that's kind of where that question comes in is, does this kind of gather, grow, and go, this like three kind of little programmatic pieces, do those help make full disciples? I think they help make some kind of disciples and make you disciples to a degree. But then the question is what's the shadow? What's the missing part of it? And like you were saying, is it doing what Jesus wants it to do? Yeah.
The one of the things that they talk about is the incompleteness of the word discipleship. And I'm not a Greek expert, so I don't really know. To be honest with you, I haven't done the work on it, but about how the word there, disciple, really is probably better translated as apprentice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tease a little bit from the book, but essentially, like that word disciple is really tied to Jesus's role as rabbi, as teacher. And so, and the culture around, because, rabbis would go and get disciples. So like what Jesus did, what we see in the Gospels, where Jesus gets students, right? He goes and calls disciples. He goes and calls them, right? He calls them away from their nets to come and follow him. It's not a thing that nobody had ever done before. Jesus did it different than anybody else had done it before. But there were other rabbis other than Jesus that went around and taught, other rabbis who went and got students to follow them and things like that. And so it wasn't like, the apostles, the disciples were like, what's he mean? Come and follow him. They knew what he meant. Come and be my student. Come be with me, be like me, and do what I do, right? Which is, the paradigm that's in Comer's book. And so his argument is that, because disciple is kind of an antiquated word for us. We don't use it anywhere, but a word that maybe makes better sense is, he argues, is apprentice. And you said student, right? That also kind of works.
Yeah.
Except it carries probably too much of a
academic or intellectual model. Yeah. Where apprentice gets a little bit more to the heart of like the role of like demonstration.
Yeah.
the role of demonstration on the part of the teacher or master or whomever, and then the expectation that the apprentice allow that demonstration to inform their own work.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it in terms of, because they mention this, of like, it's training.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we talk about discipleship, it's training. We're talking about apprenticing Jesus. We're being trained.
Yep.
And I'm currently training to run a marathon in May. And like, I'm not out of shape by any means.
No.
But like, I'm also not necessarily in marathon shape.
Sure.
I'm not in running shape.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been training, and I have been running and making sure my strength program is like conducive to runner strength, not necessarily like the other types of things that I was doing. And the reality is that if I went out and tried to run the marathon right now with little training, my body and my mind's response to it would be like failure.
Yeah.
You're gonna fail.
Right.
It's gonna crash and burn.
Yeah. We'd find you halfway,
right,
curled up in a ball.
Right. And
you'd find me a quarter of the way.
One of the things that I have done is like, I have enlisted the help of someone who has run marathons before, and they've developed a training plan for me. Going to run this many miles on this day, this many miles on this day, this many miles on this day, right? And week by week by week, the miles increase until you get to the point where you can successfully run the marathon. Mm-hmm. And what I feel like the church does, which is an interesting way to talk about it, because I am essentially talking about myself.
Yeah, I know. This feels really like, are we calling ourselves out?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the shadow.
Yeah.
We're just talking about the reality of it.
Right.
I actually said this Sunday from the pulpit. I was like, well, you want to know the answer to intimacy with Jesus? You're not going to like the answer, because it's the same answer that's always been. Mm-hmm. Right? It's intentional time with him. Right? It's, building out time with him, time in his word.
Yep.
Right. Time in prayer, listening to, like, speaking in prayer, listening in prayer, responding in prayer, not just hearing, but doing.
Yep.
The things like obeying his commands.
Right.
We're talking from John chapter 15, those who love me obey my commands.
Yep.
And so where was I going with that?
The church is kind of guilty. You were on that training metaphor.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, the church is kind of guilty of just saying, read your Bible more, pray more, come to church. Mm-hmm. Just do that. Mm-hmm. Just do that. And that's kind of I feel like the parallel of being just go run the marathon.
Yeah.
Just put your running shoes on. Mm-hmm. Put your running clothes on, and just go out and start running, and just don't stop until you're done, and then you're a marathon runner. Mm-hmm. Right? Where it's not taking into account that there are people who are obese and out of shape, and their nutrition is bad, and they've never run a mile, and now we want them to run 26.2. And so I take that kind of correlation into the life of discipleship or apprenticeship or training or whatever. And the thing is that I actually still think that the answer is the answer. Mm-hmm. Or at least it's a part of the answer. I still do think that, time with the Lord in his word and in prayer and doing the things that I think that's part of the answer.
Yeah, it is.
But the question is what is our expectation of people's intensity in that?
Right.
And are we showing them what it means to read the word?
Yeah.
Are we showing them what it means to pray? Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, and he modeled prayer, and he brought them along with him as he prayed, and they heard his prayers, and they witnessed his prayers, and he taught them about prayer, right? And so he was offering them like the apprentice model of prayer development, prayer life. So my question then for myself and for the shadow life of the church is, okay, am I expending energy as a pastor and shepherd and teacher and all that in helping people walk the first mile?
Yeah.
Am I teaching them how to read the word? Am I breaking down the barriers of like the social church constructs that says you have to read 3 chapters a day, and you have to do it every day,
and you got to start in Genesis,
and you got to get up at 5 a.m.
with your perfectly brewed coffee,
right?
Post it on Instagram,
which is kind of like the expectation. But is it apprenticing people?
Right.
I don't think it is.
Yeah. Or like it's because like I'm going to make an assumption because I don't train with you. I don't know any martial arts, but I'm assuming that when you train people in jiu-jitsu, like you're like scaffolding them. You've got to teach like a basic like move or form or thing to do. And then I'm probably even when you're kind of like practicing with them, you're probably even just kind of like, all right, they kind of did that right, but you're not really like, when you're sparring with someone who's just brand new, you're not going full bore.
No.
You're probably just like, okay, I need them to get this technique down, even though I know I can counter that with this. I'm just simply not going to use that.
Yeah. I'm teaching my son jiu-jitsu right now.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Who is like half your height.
Yeah.
And but then there's also, so I think you're right. I think there's that we're not giving people that early scaffolding, that early learning. But then I also think that there's this other component in which there are people who have managed to make it to a certain level, and then they don't know what else is next, or they don't know how to get to the next thing.
Yep.
Because there's different types of praying, and different ways to read scripture, and different levels on which to read scripture. And, those don't always fit into programs, or at least traditional evangelical programs, as nicely or neatly. And that leaves people getting to a certain level, and then they're like, okay, well, I've stalled out here. And then what are they going to do?
Yep. Yeah. Agree. So I think it requires a little bit of honest examination by churches to say, when I think this is John Mark Comer's frustration with the church is, when are we going to stop doing this and start doing something else?
Yeah.
When are we going to recognize, admit, and then rectify the reality that this is not doing for people what
we hope it would,
right,
or what we think Christ wants from us.
Right. So, that's an honest question that needs examination, I think, by every church leader.
Yeah.
Myself included.
We're trying. We're thinking about it.
We are.
Does that help?
I mean, I think so.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah. If you want some good reading, I would we'll link the podcast here, the Nieuwhof podcast. We'll link John's new book, Practicing the Way.
Yep.
And maybe we can link The Critical Journey. book as well.
Yep.
And those give you an opportunity for some deeper learning if you want, or some deeper exposure to these ideas.
Yep.
And as always, if you feel like you have something to say about this or other things, you want to comment on the video. If you're watching on YouTube, it's easiest there probably. Please do so. If you have a question or a comment, or you want us to kind of tackle some topic that's been on your mind or heart or scripture or whatever, you can always text it to us. We have a texting line here for the podcast. It's 716-201-0507. And we will, we'll address that pretty quick usually. I mean, we record every week, so we'd like to be able to get to those. As always, if you would, we thank you for listening.
Sure
if you
do.
would like this episode, like the podcast, share it, subscribe to it wherever it is you're listening. If you're not, any of those things, that would be super helpful and encouraging for us. You'll be happy to know that we get paid nothing for this.
Zero.
So,
We're not sponsored by anything yet.
We're not sponsored by anything, although I still am looking for sponsorships from energy drink companies. But new year, new me. I have drastically reduced my consumption of energy drinks. So
Good for you.
I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of study on the
Like half-life of stuff?
This is a PS to the podcast, but like some of you know, some of you don't know that I have a second job as a chaplain for police agencies in Chautauqua County.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of my work is around helping officers process complex trauma. And in my reading, one of the major times that officers process complex trauma is during REM sleep, or when people process complex trauma is during REM sleep. Your brain replays those, and your eyes going back and forth kind of puts it in the right place in your brain.
Yeah.
Right? Puts that memory in the right place.
Yep.
Well, in order to
Get to REM sleep.
get to REM sleep, you have to go to sleep.
Yes.
You know, and there is a tremendous issue within the law enforcement community.
Yeah.
The overconsumption of caffeine.
Yeah. Working a long shift, working a late shift, like let's just pound a Monster or a Red Bull.
Couple,
or
they come on shift, they grab a coffee in their car, and then a couple hours later, it's a energy drink, and then towards the end of the shift, they're on a long call, they need to pick me up, they grab another one, and so on a shift, you're 6, 7, 8, 900 milligrams of caffeine into your body, and then you go home and you try to sleep. They can't sleep, and so what do? They have a drink.
Right. Which
Alcohol.
doesn't actually, which also it might help you fall asleep initially.
Does not help you.
It disrupts REM sleep.
Yes, it disrupts
Alcohol
REM.
disrupts REM.
Right. So now you have an overconsumption of caffeine and an overconsumption of alcohol, and you miss REM sleep.
Yeah.
And then you do that over the course of a 20 to 25 year career.
Yeah.
And your ability to process complex trauma has been greatly diminished.
Yeah.
Because you had too many energy drinks,
And-
or as a part of that.
Yeah. And caffeine too, like has that like half-life.
12-hour half-life.
So it takes so long for that cup of coffee you had at even noon to be out of your system.
So if I have a 150 milligrams of caffeine cup of coffee at noon, which is a pretty high, it's a pretty big cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Usually coffee's like 80 to 90 milligrams for an 8-ounce cup.
Yeah.
So say I have a 16-ounce cup, I'm in the 150 to 200 milligram range of caffeine at 12 noon. At midnight, I'm going to have half that.
Yeah.
So caffeine has a half-life of 12 hours. So at midnight, I'm going to have, best case scenario, 100 milligrams of caffeine in my system.
Right. Still affecting it.
Still disruptive to REM.
Yeah.
So, I said a lot to say. I'm still willing to take energy drink sponsorships. We'll just have to record way earlier in the day. And yeah, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, which that is really fascinating to me. So I've been reading a lot on it. It's super important.
It is. Take care of your body too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.